Welcome to our 7th lesson. We're now entering the last third of this journey together, and I hope you've been enjoying the lessons so far. We've covered a lot of ground. We started with an overview of Islam, the basic pillars of Islam, and the spiritual understanding of Islam. We have looked at the key concepts of the Sufi tradition and how those teachings are understood, especially in the context of knowledge and love as the two basic schools of Sufism. And in this last third of our time together, we will be looking at the practical side. How do Sufis practice their spirituality? How is it practically organized inside the Sufi orders? How did those orders emerge in history? And also, how do Sufis express their spirituality and their love for God in different art forms like poetry, music, calligraphy, and even Sufi architecture, Islamic architecture? So this will be the focus of our last 3 lessons. Today I would like to start with a recitation of one of my favorite surahs, the Surah Al-Asr. And I like it because it is a powerful reminder of our task as humans on earth. And please bear with my Arabic pronunciation. I'll try to do my best. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Consider the flight of time. Verily, man is at loss, unless he be among those who attain to faith, and those who do good works, and those who enjoin upon one another the keeping to truth, and who enjoin upon one another patience. So this surah is a reminder that time is limited. Our time, our life is limited. Consider the flight of time. Al-Asr is also the word for afternoon. So it's the time of the day when the sun is gradually nearing the horizon, is gradually setting. And it's a metaphor for our life. Each breath, we are moving closer towards our death. So it's a powerful reminder really to bring that awareness that we have a finite amount of time here in this body. Verily, man is at loss. Or as Muhammad Assad translates, man is bound to lose himself. So we are at a loss unless we spend our time by developing faith, developing that certainty of the heart, unless we spend our time by doing good works, pure actions, amilu salihati, and unless we advise and we nudge each other to stick to the truth, to adhere to the truth, to lead truthful lives, to lead lives that are in truth with who we are. And unless we advise each other to patience, so spreading truth and patience. Whenever I hear or I recite this surah, it really helps me come back to my center and helps me remember what is really at the heart of my life. Rumi says, this journey of being a human is very difficult unless you find a master, someone who can guide you through this life, especially if you are entering the spiritual path. He says, whoever travels without a guide needs 200 years for a 2-day journey. So let's try to understand this with the metaphor of a mountain. All the different paths of Islam and of Sufism, the turuq of the different orders and groups and different spiritual schools, they are like paths leading to the top of a mountain, right? We are all trying to reach that summit of God realization, but we all take different paths from different sides. By the way, this metaphor can also work for the different religions or all the different spiritual traditions, because ultimately the summit is one and the same. But as in mountain climbing, you need an experienced guide, especially if you reach the high altitudes. So there is a shortage of oxygen. There are all kinds of dangers. You may slip, you may fall. There might be wild animals. So you need an experienced guide who can take you to those high altitudes, the high altitudes of spiritual climbing, so to say. And the masters, they are the ones who have already reached the summit, who have climbed the mountains and who know the path and the dangers of the path. And upon coming back from the summit, descending back, they drew a map of the path that they walked. So all those teachings and all those doctrines, they are like maps, like road maps drawn by the masters who have climbed to the top and who are now coming back to lead other humans to the summit. So Sufi doctrine and Sufi teachings are not some kind of a philosophical speculation, some kind of mental concepts, as you know, with the shallow understanding of philosophy, but they're actually the fruit of spiritual realization, the fruit of spiritual experience that is then shared with others. So Sufi teachings, Sufi doctrine is at the beginning of the path, and it's also at the end of the path. Because once you have walked that path with the help of this map, with the help of these teachings, and you will have reached the summit, then you can also draw your own map, and you can then serve to guide others. So those masters, those climbers, those master climbers, in Sufism, they are called the shuyukh, or the singular, sheikh. Sheikh simply means an elder in the Arabic language, an old man. And in Persian, you use the word pir, which also means old. So when someone enters the Sufi path, he or she usually takes an initiation or bay'at from a master, from a sheikh. And with that vow of initiation, the disciple becomes open to the blessing, to the spiritual force, the barakah of the path. And the soul of the disciple becomes ready for transformation. The source of this barakah and the source of this spiritual guidance, as we've already said before, is the Prophet Muhammad in the traditional Sufi understanding, because he is the first guide on the Sufi path. And then followed by Ali. Ali, the cousin and also son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad, who in the tradition is the one who received all the spiritual secrets from Muhammad. So that's why we have a famous hadith in which Muhammad says, I am the city of knowledge and Ali is the gate. So we have 3 stages of surrender. Surrender in the Sheikh, following the Sheikh. Then surrender in Muhammad, in the Prophet. That's one level higher. And then, of course, the highest level being surrender to God, to Allah. The Sufi, by surrendering himself to the Sheikh, because the Sheikh is the closest, the most physical manifestation of this path, by that, the disciple trains himself to then surrender to the Prophet and to Allah. And they say that the Sufi should be in the hands of the master, like a corpse in the hand of the corpse washer. So you have that image of the dead body being washed before it is buried in the ground. So that's according to the Islamic tradition, you wash the body before it is buried. So that's quite a drastic image of the kind of surrender, like a dead body in the hands of the master, fully surrendered to the will of the master. And that is, of course, not to be mistaken with passivity, because surrender is also a form of action, actually. It requires a great striving inside against the own self, against the own egoic tendencies, so that you can really surrender and the master can take you along on the path. Now you have also in Sufism a group of Sufis who are called Uwaisi. They're in the minority because they are the ones who never were instructed by a living physical master. Instead, they receive initiation through dreams or through visions of masters who lived in the past, or even by the Prophet Muhammad. And such was the case with a man called Uwais al-Qarani, a Yemeni man who lived at the time of the Prophet but never actually met the Prophet. But on some spiritual realms, they were in touch with each other. And the Prophet was aware of this man, of Uwais al-Qarani, and he actually told Ali and Umar to seek him out, to meet him. So in order to remember this man, Uwais al-Qarani, whose love for the Prophet is said to have been so strong that he reached spiritual perfection without ever meeting the Prophet. So this term Uwaisi was then coined and was used for the Sufis who never had any physical master. But the norm is that you enter into a spiritual path, into a tariqah, into a brotherhood, a Sufi order, through an initiatory rite. And with that initiatory rite, that initiation, the master would often bestow a cloak or some kind of cloth on the disciple. It's called the khirqa. And with that transferring of the cloth, transferring his own spiritual realization upon the disciple. So you enter that kind of field of the master, and by taking your oath, the oath to obey the Sheikh and through the Sheikh to obey Allah, with that oath, you officially take the hand of the master and you enter this path under his guidance. And usually in this ceremony of initiation, other disciples are also witnessing. The student first has to make a prayer of repentance, of leaving behind his own or her own life. And then in a state, of course, of ritual purity, you seal this bond and you enter this path. Now, of course, the master has a very high responsibility on this path because the disciple is entrusted to him. And my teacher in Iran told me that one of the topics that Rumi repeats most in his Masnavi is warning people of false masters, masters who speak like the Sufis, who dress up like the Sufis, but in fact, they cause the disciples to choose the wrong path, or they cause you to go on a detour. So, what are the characteristics of a real master according to the Sufi tradition? A master, first of all, has to possess right ethics and proper conduct according to the Sharia. A master will never try to attract disciples of another master by claiming that he is more attained or he's a better master. And the disciple is never the possession of the master. So he has to treat the disciple in a very careful way as a deposit that God has placed in his hands or in her hands, if the master is a woman. The education of the disciple is his responsibility that he must fulfill with humility and at no cost. So he's not meant to take any money for this. His work is a service. And the master has to possess the skill of putting himself in the place, into the shoes of the disciple, knowing exactly what level of understanding the disciple has, and according to that, choosing a type of language and a type of maturity that the disciple will be able to understand. As far as I have understood and observed, the signs of a true master are, first of all, that the master is humble and even maybe acknowledges that he doesn't know everything. He knows that he doesn't know. And there is a humor. There is a humor and an almost childlike, playful attitude. When you find these kinds of characteristics along with profound simplicity and profound presence and attention, that kind of aura of presence, when you find those character traits, then you can be sure that you're sitting in front of a master. And of course, if the master at any point is going astray or is trespassing the law, is trespassing the Sharia, or the master proves to be spiritually inefficient, cannot take the disciple further on the path, then the disciple, also according to the Sufi tradition, is free to leave his master behind. But if that is not the case, the disciple should never see other masters without the permission of his or her own master. Now, what happens when a Sufi master dies? In some cases, Sufi masters designate someone to follow, to become the next master. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Maybe the master doesn't see any of his disciples fit enough to take on this task. So often what happens after the death of the master, as in many traditions, is that the disciples split into different groups. And often new branches emerge out of the original core group. And this is why in the silsilas, the silsila is the line of transmission in a Sufi tariqah, in a Sufi brotherhood. That's why often you find that silsilas have many, many different branches that emerged over time and in different geographies. So the silsila, which you can call like the family tree of a Sufi order, always starts, of course, with the Prophet Muhammad, and then usually goes through Ali. As we said, Ali is the gate to knowledge, and then goes on through the the closest members of the Prophet's family, and through the first caliphs, and through the first masters of the path, and then it can extend all the way to the present day. And each Sufi master has to prove and has to link himself or herself to such a lineage, so that he has that spiritual backing. Once you enter a tariqah, a Sufi order, you enter a spiritual community where there are deep ties between the different members. So you make a commitment to grow together. And there is, of course, a deep sense of belonging together, because you know that you have known each other since times eternal, since the primordial covenant of Alast. Maybe you remember when God asked the souls, am I not your Lord? And all those souls who were together, they responded, yes, you are. So you're actually meeting each other again, you're remembering each other, and you form a spiritual family. Of course, these brotherhoods also in Islamic civilizations, they formed social support systems. So once you're a member, or your family is a member of that order, you have a certain kind of security. There is a community life. For example, in Üsküdar, the neighborhood where I'm living in Istanbul, there used to be, up to the end of the Ottoman Empire, dozens of such communities, dozens of dargas, as you call the gathering places of these orders, dargas. And in these dargas, they were not only for coming together and praying, but at the same time there were places to eat together. There was usually a soup kitchen where people are fed, especially people who don't have the means, poor people. Also libraries, so places of social gathering and places of knowledge. Goethe, the great German poet, has a beautiful verse which goes like this: Und solang du dies nicht hast, dieses stirb und werde, bist du nur ein trüber Gast auf der dunklen Erde. So it was time to quote something in my mother tongue, and it translates like this: and as long as you haven't experienced this, to die and so to grow, you are only a troubled guest on the dark earth. So here we have actually the very Sufi idea of dying before you die in a German poem. And this is what the disciple is, of course, aspiring when he seeks the guidance of a master. So first of all, you need to have this yearning for your own perfection, to put your own ego to sleep, to bury your own ego, if you want. And the sheikh will use all kinds of methods to test the dedication and the determination of the disciple. The disciple needs to be like an empty vessel into which the divine wine can be poured. So if the vessel is full of, selfish selfish tendencies, full of this pungent liquid of selfish passions, then of course you can't pour any of that wine into the cup. So first of all, you have to become empty. Let's listen to this story that is told by the Persian poet Jami. Once upon a time, a young man became the student of a sheikh, and the sheikh gave him the job of cleaning the latrines. His mother, who was a wealthy physician, asked the sheikh to give her tender young son some other job. So she sent the sheikh 12 Ethiopian slaves to clean the toilets instead. The sheikh replied, "You are a physician. If your son had an inflammation of the gallbladder, should I give the medicine to an Ethiopian slave instead of giving it to him?" So that's the logic. We all have this sickness, and so we need the treatment. The great dervish and the great Sufi poet Yunus Emre, when he first entered the path of his master Tabtuk Emre, he was a very proud judge, Sharia judge, who came with his ego, thinking that I know it all and everyone else knows nothing. So what the sheikh told him to do was to repeat the mantra, "I don't know, I don't know." So whenever someone asked him a question or someone asked him for an advice, he had to repeat like a mantra, "I don't know, I don't know." So imagine how difficult it is for someone who is used to always being the one who knows. In the Mevlevi tradition, the tradition that's founded on Rumi's teachings, a disciple who enters the order before even starting to receive the guidance of the master has to prove himself in the kitchen by serving for 1001 days. And in these 1001 days, the master observes the will and the dedication of the disciple. And those tasks that are given to the aspirant are usually some very simple tasks like cleaning the floor or cutting the vegetables. And if you can pass through these 1001 days without complaining, then you are deemed fit to enter the spiritual training. There are some other more rigorous methods of education that were used in some Sufi orders, like masters striking their disciples with a stick or keeping them thirsty until they achieved spiritual maturity. In some Sufi texts, the master is described as a foster mother who offers the child the breast filled with the spiritual milk. And once the disciple has grown mature enough, they say that he has been weaned, he has been taken off the milk of the disciple. So on this spiritual path, the aspirant passes through all different stations and states, the maqam and the hal, the maqamat and the ahwal, which we have already looked at in, I think, 2 lessons ago. This kind of psychological journey, the different levels of the nafs. Attar speaks about the 7 valleys in his famous Mantiq al-Tayr, the Conference of the Birds, which are called aspiration, love, knowledge, independence, unity, bewilderment, and annihilation. So, however we kind of try to to structure this path that, of course, looks different for each disciple, because if each disciple has a different background, it is a journey of letting go and a journey of struggling, of course, because the ego will always try to take you off this path. And here, the master is the one who is always at your side and who will guide you back onto the way. Dreams also play a very important role in this. So Sufis have developed very sophisticated ways to interpret dreams. For example, the Sufi Master and Saint Aziz Mahmoud Hudai, who has his tomb very close to where I live, here in Üsküdar, was very famous for his dream interpretation. So the sultans of the Ottoman court, whenever they had an important dream, they would come to Hudai and ask him to interpret their dreams. And also before they took important decisions, like should they go to war or important affairs in their state. So dreams give signs and pointers on the spiritual path, and they can reveal certain things about the spiritual development of the disciple. Of course, nowadays, this environment of spiritual education, even in the Islamic world, is largely gone, because nowadays our worldview is not connected anymore to this tradition. We are so cluttered with modern science, with modern intellectual concepts, with ideas or ideologies like secularism, rationalism, positivism, that clutter the minds of people, that it is, of course, takes much more to enter this path nowadays, I would say. But at the same time, we also have a rise in consciousness. We have a knowledge that is more readily available nowadays at the click of the mouse, if you have right discernment and if you have that right vision and determination to become a full human being, as it is expressed so beautiful in the Surah Al-Asr. If you want to be among the ones who advise each other to truth and who advise each other to patience. Let's look at another term that is very central, which is the concept of adab. Someone who enters the Sufi path needs to have adab. What is adab? Adab is a word that is very difficult to translate. It can be translated into English as some kind of courtesy, comportment, politeness, a culture that is refined speech. It's also connected to the word adabiyat, which is literature. And it also comprises correct ethical values, ethical attitudes. So it's the right way to behave, the right way to think, the right way to act on the spiritual path. From how to greet people to how to treat your master, how to eat in a proper way, how to sit in a gathering, how to enter a place of worship with respect. Carrying yourself in a manner that is worthy of the human state, of the human level, which is, according to the Sufi perspective, the highest level of creation. We have all those jewels, all those potentials in us. So we need to carry ourselves with the right sense of adab, as it befits a human. Now let's look a little bit at the essential practices of Sufis, spiritual practices on their path. Of course, first of all, we have, according to the Sharia, the ritual prayer called Salah or Namaz in Farsi, which is deeply integrated into Islamic daily life, as we've already said. Especially in modern society, a society that is built on worldly success, on material achievements, stepping consciously out of this realm and taking yourself, taking a step back and moving in front of God 5 times a day is a powerful practice. Now, most of you will be familiar with the movements of the Islamic prayer. So you, first of all, you stand upright. Let me show this actually in a chart so it will be easier to understand. Here you have the different movements of the Islamic prayer. So Al-Qiyam, the straight standing position, is the human being, is the position of the human being, and represents the stage of individuality, of strength, of uprightness, of being clear in your identity as a human being. Then you move into ruku, which is sometimes called the animal state. It is the state of coming into humility, of becoming humble in front of the divine. And then the third posture is the posture of sujud, which is sometimes called the mineral state. So you move into full surrender, surrender of all your faculties, your body, your mind, your soul towards the divine. So there is actually a very deep symbology in those movements of the Islamic prayer. And as a condition, even before you pray, you have the ablution called abdest in Turkish, wudu, which is the right way of purifying with water, first of all, your mouth, your nose, your wrists up to the elbows, your face, your hair, your forehead, your ears, and then the feet. So let's also look at this in a video that I took in the old city of Lahore at a very beautiful mosque called the Wazir Khan Mosque. Let's see. So this is the traditional way, especially in South Asia. You have a big water basin in the courtyard of the mosque where everyone is taking their ablution. In Turkey, it's always through a tap. So you have a tap, you have running water, which is probably more hygienic, where you perform your ritual washings before the prayer. So what is the meaning of these washings? First of all, the cold water helps you to come into a state of presence, to a state of alertness for the prayer. Sufis, they place special importance on these ablutions because for them it is also a symbol for the purification of the soul. Then there is the practice of dua, which is the normal private prayer, supplication to God. And the Sufis here have a beautiful perspective because they say that it is God himself who is already giving the prayer to the one who prays. So God would not let us pray if he hadn't already answered our prayers. As Nifari says, to me belongs the giving. If I had not answered your prayer, I would not have made you seeking it. Now we'll come to a very important and central element of the Sufi path, which is the practice of dhikr. Dhikr means remembrance. And there is this idea that everything in creation is constantly remembering God. When the birds sing, they are remembering God. When the leaves of the tree rustle in the wind, they are doing that in their remembrance of God. The same goes for the humming bees. Only the human being is forgetful. So the human being has to be in this intentional practice of remembering God, of coming back to his essence. There's a beautiful story I would like to share with you from one of the Turkish Sufi lodges. There was a master called Sümbül Efendi. And one day Sümbül Efendi told his disciples to go out into the garden, because Sümbül Efendi had a big garden with beautiful, fragrant, colorful flowers. And he told his disciples, the one who brings me the most beautiful flowers will be my successor. So, of course, all the disciples are very excited. They go out, they venture out, they pick the most beautiful flowers, and they return with large bouquets of the most splendid flowers. But only one disciple, he comes back with a rose that has already withered. And of course, all the disciples are confused. Why is he coming with this rose that is already dead? And the master waves the student to himself and asks, why did you bring this rose to me? And the student replies, I looked at the garden, and wherever I looked, the flowers, they were in a state of dhikr, in a state of remembering God. It was only this rose that has already withered, that had finished its dhikr. And the master smiled, and he said, you are going to be my successor. So we said our normal human situation is one of forgetfulness. We become forgetful. We are in a state of spiritual sleepiness. So to be truly human means to remember, to acknowledge, and to confirm what we already know deep inside. All of Islam, we can actually say, is about this remembrance, about remembering our essence. So all of Islam is in fact about dhikr. And the conscious practice of dhikr through the invocation of God's names, called dhikrullah, is a powerful tool to bring that remembrance about in daily life. Now, the word dhikr is mentioned in the Quran about 270 times in its various forms. And we have verses such as in the 18th surah, invoke your Lord when you forget, or remember me and I will remember you in the second surah. And the Quran even says the invocation of God is that which is greater in the 29th surah. So it shows that the practice of dhikr is superior to other forms of worship. Why? Because only dhikr is prescribed for every moment. So we strive to come to this state where we can remember God in every moment. We can remember our essence and live from that essence in every moment. Whereas other practices like the prayer or fasting in Ramadan, they have certain times and they are also object to exemption, but not the remembrance of God. Another famous saying from the Quran is, only in the remembrance of God, hearts find tranquility. So we need this remembrance in order to come back to our center. And where does this remembrance happen? It happens in the heart. Our hearts find tranquility through the remembrance of God, not in the intellect, because the intellect likes to analyze, likes to segregate, it denies, it negates, whereas the heart is the place of unity, the place of affirmation, the place of illallah. So the dhikrullah, the remembrance of God, awakens the awareness of God inside the human heart. And Sufi masters use certain formulas, certain mantras or names of God and give them as a practice, as a dhikr practice to their disciples, so that through this recitation, certain spiritual potentialities and character traits can be awakened in the human being. And each of the divine names has a certain effect. And the master, of course, sees exactly what the disciple needs and chooses the name according to that need. Once it is said that someone came to the Prophet Muhammad and complained that there are so many duties and so many rules in Islam. And the Prophet simply responded, "Let your tongue stay moist with the remembrance of God." Now, what does this mean? It really means that the remembrance of God is the supreme form of worship. And that's why Sufis place such an emphasis on the practice of dhikr. Now, to enter dhikr, there are a couple of conditions. First of all, you need to be in a state of ritual purity. So you need to have taken ablution. You have done your ritual washings, and you should wear clean clothing. Ideally, dhikr should be practiced at night or in a darkened place. The Prophet used to practice dhikr between dawn and sunrise. Between dawn and sunrise, the time when the mind and the body are not yet fully awake. And the place where the dhikr is performed will be scented maybe with beautiful fragrances. You keep your eyes closed or half closed, turned towards the Qibla, which is the direction of Mecca, the direction of the prayer. And you begin to direct your heart towards God. You ask for God's guidance and for your mind to be free of distraction. So one of those mantras or phrases that are used for dhikr, of course, is La ilaha illallah. And in that practice, often you have a movement of the head moving from one shoulder through the heart to the other shoulder, like this. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. And this goes on, and of course it can become faster. And sometimes all that is left then is illallah, 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 Allah, 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 the repetition of God's name. So let's look at this in a video of a traditional Turkish dhikr ceremony.
محمد رسول الله حقا وصدقا بسر قراءة الفاتحة اللهم
So you can see in this clip how the movements, the breath is aligned with those formulas like La ilaha illallah, how everything becomes a whole, and how the group moves together as if they are all part of one breath, one single body. And that is, of course, an experience of ecstasy that in these group dhikrs is the highlight for many Sufis on the path. Now, there are different Sufi groups. Some of them say that dhikr should be practiced aloud and in a group. And some say, no, dhikr is something that is silent and happens only inside the human heart and should be practiced in privacy. But most Sufi masters nowadays say that beginners should evoke God aloud to push back against the thoughts and against the attacks of the mind. So with your voice, your concentration can be strengthened. Now, there are also some Sufi groups in which music and dance are used. You heard maybe in the clip just now that there was a melodic recitation in the background that even helps to deepen this experience of trance. And then there are some groups, for example, the Rufais, who practice dhikr at a very high voice with a huge volume. In fact, I've visited Rufai dhikrs in Istanbul, and these dhikrs, they can sometimes take up to 2 hours, and they become really ecstatic and really loud. And usually they are practiced also in a very small physical space that is dark, maybe with the light of some candles. And in the end, you can imagine the room gets very hot because of all this energy. Dhikrs are usually attended by both genders, but the women have a separate area, and sometimes their dhikr is led by an elderly lady of the Sufi group, sometimes the wife of the sheikh. And many of those gatherings, they are also open to visitors who are not part of that Sufi order. For example, we have a famous darga or tekke, as they call it in Turkish, in the neighborhood Fatih, which is called the Karagümrük Tekkesi. And that place is very famous because they have dhikr twice a week on Thursday nights, which is the traditional night to have dhikr. It's the night before Friday, the holy day of the Muslim week, and on Monday nights. And anyone can come and can take part in these dhikrs. So dhikr ceremonies also often are kind of a visiting card of the Sufi order, something where the Sufi orders also include non-members to receive that purifying effect of the ceremony. Now, in the Sufi understanding, the dhikr of the tongue is only the first stage of dhikr. But eventually, what is really aimed at is this continuous dhikr of the heart, where the heart remembers God without the tongue even needing to utter any formula. And the goal is eventually that state of continuous remembrance of God in every moment. And the one who has reached that state, of course, doesn't need any more ceremonies or doesn't need any more invocational practices. Another practice of the Sufis, which you also have in other religions, is the practice of silent retreat, or khalwa, called halvet in Turkish, and çelle in Farsi. Çelle comes from the word chehel, which means 40, because the traditional number for these days of retreat is 40. And the khalwa is based on the retreats that Muhammad used to have in the cave at Hira. You remember from his life story, it is that cave where he used to retreat and meditate and where he received his first revelation. So in the khalwa, in the retreat, you withdraw yourself from public life for a specific amount of time. And even ordinary Muslims try to practice this state of retreat during the last days of Ramadan, the last 10 days of Ramadan. In early Sufism, you had a lot of ascetics who retreated into caves or into the deserts, living among the wild animals and meditating in ruins and in cemeteries, cemeteries and graves being a reminder of the transience of our life, of the world. And of course, in these retreats, these very intense times of purification, you needed to have the supervision of a Sufi master who sometimes comes and checks on you, or if you have certain visions or dreams or confusion or some experiences, you go to the master, and the master then helps you interpret those states. And he helps you also discern hallucinations from authentic spiritual phenomena. Of course, those visions and those dreams, they are never the goal of the spiritual path. They are just some certain kind of signs along the way to help you move on. There is a story about a Sufi who, after his 40 days of retreat, suddenly came out of his cell and started to see people according to their spiritual state. For example, if someone was in a kind of animal state or at a very low state of let's say, perfection, then he would see them with the face of a pig or the face of a monkey. And the man, he was terrified, and he went back into his cell and he said, "Oh Allah, please relieve me from this state." And then Allah took this kind of this ability from him. So you have these funny stories in Sufi literature telling about what Sufis saw and experienced during these intense retreats. Sometimes these retreats were performed in a state of fasting. And obviously, you were meant to also sleep very little and stay awake at night, because night is the time where the vision becomes most clear, and that sort of illumination can take place. The Naqshbandis, we already talked about some early Sufis performing their retreats in graveyards. Now, the Naqshbandis, a Sufi order that originated in Central Asia, they had a practice in which they imagined themselves as being dead, as a dead corpse, buried and in a state of advanced decomposition. So you already try to picture your physical death as a powerful tool to remember that everything is transient. We should not get attached to anything, which is also one of the fundamental teachings of Buddhism. Now, there is one more practice in Sufism that I would like to speak about, which is probably the practice most known in the West. It is the tradition of Sama or Sema in Turkish pronunciation. And Sema means literally listening. It comes from the Arabic root for listening. So, what is this listening? It is the ritual movement, sometimes called the dance of the dervishes, the whirling. And if we go to the root of this word sama, we see that here it is actually not a performance, but at the center of it is a deep act of listening. And these ceremonies are often accompanied by auditions of music. So we have the meditation in movement, the whirling, together with music and recitations of poetry. But we have to say that this practice of so-called Sufi dance, which is actually not a dance because it's more than that, but this practice of Sufi dance is something which was only practiced in certain groups, in certain Sufi groups, and they are in the minority. Other Sufi circles, they were more skeptical about this practice. So we find a lot of discussions whether Sema, whether this form of movement together with music is actually something that is helpful on the spiritual path, or it is something that is more likely to take you away from the path because of, the risk where it distracts you or it turns into a kind of show or performance. So some Sufi authors have actually warned of these risks. So we, of course, know the ceremony, the Sema ceremonies of the whirling dervishes in Turkey that belong to the Mevlevi order. In white, one arm stretched up towards the heaven and one arm held down towards the earth. So you're receiving from above and giving to the earth. We'll actually come to this at the end of this session, the aspect of being in the world and giving back. So we have talked now about spiritual practices and spiritual exercises on the Sufi path, but how does that really translate in day-to-day life, serving in the world? And we already said that after fana, which is the annihilation of the self, the dissolution of the self in God, you have another stage with this, which is the state of baqa, returning back into the world to serve your fellow human beings. And Sufis here, of course, they have the example of Prophet Muhammad, who was in the middle of life as a husband, as a politician, as a warrior, as a family man, as a community leader, and so on and so forth. In the very same way, Sufi masters, they are often people with a normal job. They can be tailors, they can be tradesmen in the bazaar, or even, farmers. So I met this Sufi in the east of Iran, who is an enlightened soul and an old man in his 80s, and he spent all his life farming. So being in the world, doing your job and serving society is the ideal of the Sufi path. There is a quote by an Iranian saint, the famous Abu Said Abul Khair, who says, "If you wish to draw near to God, you must seek God in the hearts of others. You should speak well of all, whether present or absent. If you seek to be a light to guide others, then, like the sun, you must show the same face to all. To bring joy to a single heart is better than to build many shrines for worship. And to enslave one soul by kindness is worth more than the setting free of 1,000 slaves. The true man of God sits in the midst of his fellow men and rises up and eats and sleeps and buys and sells and gives and takes in the bazaars and marries and has a social intercourse with others, and yet he is never for one moment forgetful of God. This ideal of being in the midst of life without forgetting God is what the Naqshbandis call Khalwat dar Anjuman, or retreating in the middle of the crowd. This is actually one of the 11 principles of the Naqshbandi path. Other principles being, for example, Hush dar dam, meaning awareness of your breath. Nazar bar qadam, watching over the steps, so being aware with each step. And Safar dar watan, which means traveling inside, traveling in your homeland. So Sufis have developed all these principles, which you could really call a kind of a Sufi mindfulness. Or maybe better, Sufi heartfulness, because it's always about the transformation and the purification of the heart. What matters in our actions when we act in the world, as Sufis have always emphasized, is our intentions behind the action. So every good act helps to purify your heart, helps to move your soul more towards perfection. In a way, there is also a law of karma in Sufism, as you have it in Hinduism. Because naturally, good acts, they will bear positive fruits, and evil acts will bear negative consequences. Sayyid Hossein Nasr, in his beautiful book, The Garden of Truth, writes, "To act with love means to always give without expectation of receiving in return. But because action with love breaks the walls of the ego and makes us realize that deep down the other is our own self, one receives the greatest recompense in return. Because action with love breaks the walls of the ego and makes us realize that deep down the other is our own self, one receives the greatest recompense in return." I'm also reminded of an episode when the great teacher of Advaita Vedanta, Ramana Maharshi, in the last century, was asked, "How can I serve others?" And he simply responded, "There are no others. Who do you want to serve? There are no others." So action that is done with this kind of awareness and not with an attachment towards the fruit of your actions, that kind of pure action is what the Sufis seek to cultivate. But usually when we act, we have some or the other selfish motive behind our action. We want to earn praise, we want to earn maybe material rewards, we want to be acknowledged for our work. But the Sufi learns or strives to act from a place that is selfless, detached, with sincerity, goodness, truthfulness, and compassion. The great Persian poet Sadi says, "Do a goodly act and cast it into the Tigris River, for God will recompense thee in the desert." What does compassionate action look like in the Sufi context? Now, I think we already said that the word compassion, or the understanding of compassion in Sufism, is linked to the term rahma, which is also contained in the name Al-Rahman, the merciful, the all-compassionate. Now, because all of the universe is infused with God's compassion, this ocean of compassion, being compassionate is actually our most natural way of being. When we are compassionate, we are in tune with the deeper nature of all of existence. It is only the imprisonment by our ego that Sufis seek to overcome that prevents this inherent compassion in us to manifest itself. And I speak of experience because I often find myself in situations when I'm not really compassionate, be it with my wife or with my cat or with my family. So that's exactly why we need this sort of education to really treat our soul from its illnesses in order to become compassionate, in order to become a more compassionate human being. As Sadi beautifully says in his world famous poem, I will read it in Farsi first. بنی آدم اعضای یکدیگرند که در آفرینش ز یک گوهرند. چو عضوی به درد آورد روزگار، دگر عضوها را نماند قرار. تو کز محنت دیگران بی غمی، نشاید که نامت نهند آدمی. The children of Adam are members of a single body. For from the moment of creation, they were made of one substance. When fate causes pain in any member, the other members cannot remain still. O thou who hath no sorrow in seeing the sorrow of others, thou art not worthy of being called a human being. So Sadi really touches here the essence of what compassion is about, to recognize the suffering in each human being. Like the organs in one body, when one organ in the body is sick or fails, all the other organs are affected. So he says, all the children of Adam are like members of a single body. Of course, he speaks only of the human family here, but that compassion in Sufism has to be extended also to the natural world, to all beings, to the animals, the plants, the mountains, the streams, the deserts, the oceans, to all the elements, as we have already seen when we talked about ecology in Islam. So how does an active Sufi life look like? Sufis were often business people, sometimes very unassuming, sitting behind a desk, selling carpets, and you would never imagine that the person who's selling the carpet to you is actually an achieved Sufi master. And only if you really ask, if you inquire deeper, that master will reveal to you something of his spiritual identity. So according to the receptivity of whoever comes into the shop, they will reveal something of their nature. So we said a lot of them were ordinary business people. Sheikhs often had a very active function in society. They mediated in conflicts. They served the community through food. We already said they helped interpret people's dreams. They were often also intermediaries between people and the rulers. In many cases, the royal elite had a strong connection to the Sufi masters, or sought out their blessings. For example, in the Ottoman court, a lot of the sultans had actually Sufi sheikhs. And hospitality was a very important, and still is a very important value of Sufism, practicing ihsan, so opening your community space, your dargah, or your zawiya, that's the word in Arabic, literally meaning corner, opening your community space to travelers, to potential spiritual seekers, also to people, of course, coming from other religions and other traditions. There is a community, a Mevlevi community, that we often visit here in Istanbul, that is headed by a female teacher, and she places a lot of importance on interfaith. So she often receives Buddhist monks, Hindu swamis, priests from the Christian tradition, people of all faiths, and shows the utmost respect to them, really from this deep recognition of one truth underlying all the religions and underlying all the spiritual paths. So Sufis today also are often the ones who take initiative in cultural, artistic projects and in interfaith forums, or let's call it maybe interspiritual forums, because that is even one level deeper. And let's end with our Rumi poem for today. گرچه دیوار افکند سایه دراز، باز گردد سوی او آن سایه باز. این جهان کوه است و فعل ما ندا، سوی ما آید نداها را صدا. Although the wall casts a long shadow, the shadow turns back again towards it. This world is the mountain, and our action the shout. The echo of the shouts comes to us.